Thank you, Mick Cooper, for agreeing to do this interview on the topic of goal setting. And first, a brief introduction about yourself, and then we start. So, Mick Cooper is an internationally recognized psychologist, author, and trainer in the field of humanistic, existential, and pluralistic therapies. He's a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Repton in London, and he has published many papers and books on topics such as personalization and psychotherapy, therapeutic relationship, and also about goal setting. So, Mick Cooper, your work is really an inspirational work. So thank you again to be here. And we would like to devote all this interview specifically on the topic of goal setting. So how to make it effective and inspirational. And this is the main topic this interview will focus on. So I have a lot of questions for you, Mick. And so let's start.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start with a general question, that is, why is goal work, the goal setting and the goal work so important?
Well, I think for me, my training as a psychotherapist was in existential psychotherapy. And one of the themes across many different existential philosophers, psychologists, and writers is that as human beings, we are fundamentally what I guess I would call directional, which means that our being, we're not machines, we're not driven by just by our past, and something happens in the past and then that causes us like a machine to do things in the future. That as human beings we strive towards possibilities, meanings, we do things for reasons that we are striving for in the future. So goals are not something that are imposed upon us or something alien to us. Our very being, existentially, at the deepest existential level, is a striving towards different goals. So when I think about goals, I'm not thinking about something that gets imposed on human beings. I'm thinking more about a way of working that tries to access and engage with that deepest level of being, about where do people want to go in their lives, what's important to people, what kind of person do they want to be. That goal setting is an articulation of that deepest level of being. And I think unless we understand, if I'm working with the client, unless I understand where it is they want to be, where they're trying to get to, I can't really fully understand, empathize with, and help them get to be there. I mean, some of the goals that people have are, well, many of them are common goals around self-esteem, around happiness, around relationship is a big goal that comes out for many people. But people are often very different in their goals and what's important for them. For instance, faith might be really important for some clients, but not for others. And without knowing that, without understanding that, then it makes it really difficult to be with someone. So I see goal setting as as an opportunity to really deeply understand the people that we're being with, first and foremost.
And what is, according to you, a key question that we can use for developing effective goal talk with clients?
Well, when I work with clients, patients, when I begin in an assessment session, I think that a question around where is it you want to be in your life? Where is it that I probably wouldn't say where are you trying to get to, but kind of like if you think about 3, 5 years ahead, where would you like to be? What would you like to be different? I think is the kinds of questions that I would want to ask, and that I would keep in mind throughout my work. I'd always be thinking with clients. I might not be explicitly asking it, but I'd always want to have that sense with clients of where they are striving towards. And I think Yeah, partly in the short term, maybe in the next few months. But I think, that kind of 3, 5 year period, like where do you want to get to? When I do workshops, is a question I often ask people about where is it that you want to get to within that time scale? What are your goals for being there? So probably something along that. I wouldn't have a very kind of formal, structured way. I mean, there are ways of doing it, and I think those can be useful of saying what are your goals. But some people prefer different terms like objectives or aims or hopes or aspirations. Some people, I mean, one thing we've learned is that some people don't like the term goals. It can feel quite mechanistic and it can feel more about doing stuff rather than being. And for some people, for instance, they might think, well, in 3 years, 5 years' time, I want to be more relaxed, I want to be more settled, I want to be less driven. And if somebody's saying they want to be less driven and saying, what are your goals, might feel like you're saying that they should be kind of driving towards something. So, yeah, what are your hopes? Where would you like to be? Where would you like to be in a few years' time? That's probably for me the key question.
And what is your favorite therapeutic technique experience to help clients to stay focused on their goals?
What what we've learned from our research is that clients appreciate some level of kind of structuring guidance around goals, but also that if you ask clients too often, what are your goals? Where are you trying to get to? What's this about? That it can be too much for clients. I mean, we've developed a goal monitoring form that we would use weekly, and some of the feedback from clients was that was a bit too much, actually. Um, so I think in terms of methods, it would be around, I think rather than having very specific techniques, for me, the most important things are around asking that at the beginning, but holding it in mind, kind of like when I'm with a client, like my training was in person centered as well as existential therapy. So a big element of those therapies is around empathy and empathic engagement and being really alongside somebody deeply, phenomenologically, really trying to understand how they are experiencing the world and being inside of that to help work with them about addressing issues, addressing problems, helping them get to where they want to be. So I think more than kind of specific interventions, what's important for me is to have, when I'm working with a client, a sense of where it is that they are trying to go to. And that would be always the question for me, like that I might take to supervision, for instance. Do I have a sense of where this person is trying to be? Which might be conflicted, it might be complex, it might be nuanced, but understanding that and bringing that back with clients. And so whenever we're really talking and whenever I'm working with a client, it would be about having that sense and bringing that into the dialogue and having that sense of what they want the therapy to do with them. And if I lost that, then that would be something that I might then come back to a client and say, how does this sit? If a client's talking about something, how does this sit with where it is that you want to get to? How does it sit with where you want to go to? Um, so it's that kind of deep empathic, what I would call relational depth work that I think for me is most important around goals rather than very specific kind of micro techniques.
Yeah, but sometimes, Nick, you know that clients have need to be guided towards some healthy situation. So sometimes it's not so simple to balance the preferences of the client with what they need and what could be useful for them to be more healthy in their life. So how do you balance these two needs?
Yeah, I mean it's right. You're right that clients don't always know what they need to do to meet their goals. Sometimes um, the goals that they have, yeah, aren't necessarily the most healthy ones. A client might have a goal, for instance, to stay in a relationship when actually, as a psychologist, I'm thinking this really isn't a healthy relationship for them, that actually ultimately um, this is unhealthy. Um, but when I'm thinking it's unhealthy, it's not that I'm disagreeing with the client's goals. It's that I'm looking at a higher level. So I tend to think about goals in terms of levels. I tend to think about the kind of things that people ultimately need in their lives, and then the things that people do to try and get there, and then things that people do to try and get to those kind of lower level goals. And there's a number of different psychological models like that would kind of have that sense of a hierarchy, that we do things to get somewhere, to get somewhere, to get somewhere. So if I'm working with a client and I'm thinking, I'm not sure if that's a healthy thing, it's because I have a sense of their highest level goals, which might be around kind of being loved, feeling loved, or having a sense of self-esteem. And I'm thinking that being in this relationship, this lower level goal, actually is going to undermine them getting to those higher level goals ultimately. So I guess rather than me kind of disagreeing with the client's goals, it's more about working with them to think about, well, what is it you really want in your life? And somebody might say, well, what I want is, it's really important to feel loved and to feel the value. And then we would look at the relationship, and if I felt that actually that wasn't very healthy, rather than probably me saying, I don't feel that that's a healthy relationship, it'd be more about inviting the client to think for themselves about, is that relationship actually going to get them to the things that they really want in their life? And maybe the client would say for themselves, this relationship fulfills some need for me. Maybe it's a very immediate short-term need to feel safe and comfortable, but actually I can see that in the long term this relationship it isn't helpful. And so I'd really hope that it's something that the client understands. And I guess I would see my role as a therapist is something about, yeah, keeping them on track, but keeping them on track in terms of those highest level, most fundamental goals that they want, many of which are shared amongst us, for closeness, for self-worth, for meaning, for a sense of freedom. But as I was saying earlier, I think that they differ to some extent for some clients, around things like values. So yeah, I think very much I have a role, and it's not just about going with whatever goals clients have at these different levels. I think I would very much trust clients at those highest levels. Ultimately, only they can know what it is that they most fundamentally want. But as a psychologist, I have a role in helping them think about, okay, how do I get there? How can I most effectively get to those goals?
Perfect. And we know from researchers that have a good goal setting from the very beginning of the therapist. If therapy is a good way to have a good therapy. But sometimes it happens that people arrive to the therapy with a big confusion about their future, about their needs. So what advice do you give to mental health professionals when a client presents himself or herself without clear goal?
So just on the first part of that, I mean, having researched this area for quite a while, I would say I don't think we have evidence at this point that for all clients, goal setting is helpful or effective. I think what the research would show is that at this point, that for a number of clients and for many clients, having some process of setting goals, maybe not in the first session, maybe a few sessions down the line. We've had clients say that to be asked about their goals in a first session feels a little bit early, but maybe after a few sessions to have some experience and some conversation about goals and where they want to go to is helpful. If a client is saying from the beginning that they don't know what their goals are, I think it's important not to impose. I mean, my sense is to then kind of insist on a client setting goals isn't necessarily helpful. I think our qualitative research shows that clients, as I was saying, sometimes feel that they need some time to think about that question and to have some sense of it. Often the therapeutic work itself is a process of clarifying goals and thinking about goals, and that, that might be the therapy, is working with the client to really think about what it is that they want for the future. So I think to kind of insist that we set the risk is, if you try and set goals very, very early on, you just end up with something that's not particularly meaningful for the client, because they're feeling under pressure to say something. And there's also a risk that they can feel shamed, that they don't know what their goals are. So I would ask the question loosely, as I was saying before, ask loosely, where is it? Do you have a sense of where you want to go? If a client says no, I really don't know, I would begin, asking them about what their problems are. Often clients come to, I think clients' problems are often more proximal, are often closer to their experiencing than their goals. So it might be that clients at an early stage know more about what's going wrong than where they want to get to. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, to be with that, to allow that to be there. And then maybe over the first few sessions to start talking and asking clients about where they want to go to. Some of those clients, if you ask them very directly, what are your goals, won't be able to answer. But if you ask them a gentler question like, what would you like to change in your life over the next few years? Where would you like to get to? That's often a question that clients would find it easier to answer. I mean, having said all that, one of the things we found, and it is just one study, but we found that clients who were able to talk about their goals and liked talking about their goals and felt these goal processes were helpful tended to do much better in therapy than clients who didn't like goal setting or talking about their goals. So I think there's something about, that doesn't mean that setting goals, talking about goals is therefore helpful, because it is correlational evidence. It's just that those who liked it did better. Those who didn't like it didn't tend to do so well. But I think it maybe reflects something about clients' readiness to change, and that if a client is up for setting goals, that I think is a kind of good indicator of therapy being helpful for them. If a client is very resistant about setting goals, really doesn't want to set goals, doesn't want to talk about goals, that might be a sign that change is going to be more slow. Um, as psychologists, therapists, we often talk about stages of change, that people go through these different stages, like pre-contemplation, where they're not even aware that there's an issue that they want to work with, and then thinking and recognizing that there's an issue and then moving into action. And it's probably related to that, that if you're working with a client who's saying, I really don't know what my goals are, I don't know what I need to change or how I want change to be, it might be that they are at those kind of earlier stages. Which doesn't mean therapy is going to not be helpful, but it might mean that therapy, the process is a slower one and a more formative one, rather than actually changing through action. But you can't, just to add to that, you can't really force people to move along that process. So if somebody is at a very early stage and doesn't know what their goals, forcing goals on them probably isn't going to be helpful. It's more about coalescing and being with the client in that process of coming to identify some positive possibilities.
Yeah. And I have a curiosity that is about you in your training, if you insist on the goal setting mentality of psychologists, psychotherapists, or in general, what is your advice for colleagues to cultivate a goal setting mentality?
Yeah, so do you mean in the therapist or in the clients?
No, in therapist.
In therapist. Yeah. I it's a very good question. I mean, I wouldn't insist on it. I think therapists um, do things in different ways, and from the evidence, we know that lots of different things can be helpful, and we don't have evidence that having a goal-setting mentality in therapists leads to better outcomes. So I couldn't say that I insist on that, but I think that as a therapist, I would, in my training, I would want therapists to be able to recognize and work with the different temporal dimensions, if you like, time dimensions of a client. If I was training a therapist and they said that I'm not interested in looking at the past, I'm not going to work with the client's past, or they said I'm not going to work with the client's present, I would be a bit concerned and I would feel that they are a bit narrow in their outlook. And that, for instance, for, you know, if a client says, if a therapist, sorry, says, I don't work with clients' past, I would think, well, what's going to happen when you're with a client who wants to talk about their past? So I think in the same way, if a therapist wasn't willing or interested to look at where clients want to go to, their goals, their hopes, their future possibilities, I would be concerned, because it would feel like for some clients that is a very important area to talk about. And so I think it'd be less about insisting on a goal setting mentality, but more very much hoping that the trainees, the therapists that I work with, are open to, respectful of, and considerate about the future dimension, the future temporality of the clients that they work with, so that when clients are, for instance, talking about their goals and their hopes for the future, that they are then taking that seriously and recognizing, respecting, working with that, exploring with clients about who they want to be, rather than, for instance, insisting that the client comes back and talks about their past. I think all these dimensions, the past, the present, and the future, are all important. And for different clients, we know from our evidence that some clients want to focus more on the future, some clients want to focus more on the past, others maybe want to focus more on the present. Being respectful for clients and personalizing the therapy means really being able to work with these different dimensions and respect them depending on where the particular client is at.
Okay, very clear. And so, which theorists and which also personal experiences have most influenced your approach as a clinician, but also as a researcher?
Well, as a clinician, um, in my training, my existential training, we probably spent more time reading and talking about Heidegger, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, as well as other philosophers like Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, more than anyone else. So I think philosophically, I was very influenced by Heidegger, Frankl also, who many people will be aware of the work of Viktor Frankl and his work around the search for meaning, and Frankl in his logotherapy, um, which is one of the most widely read books in the therapy field, argues that very much that people have a need for meaning and a need for purpose, and that Frankl emphasizes this future dimension in a way that other therapists hadn't tended to, I think, up until his work. And although Frankel's approach is quite directive and quite instructive, and at times he'll even tell clients what their meaning should be, I think this idea that people have a need for meaning and a need for future possibilities, and that without that, I mean, he argues that when he was in Auschwitz and in the death camps, as many people know, that Viktor Frankl argues that people who had a sense of meaning were able to survive those conditions in a way that, or had more likelihood of surviving those conditions in a way that people who gave up hope weren't. So I think I've been very influenced by that idea that our future, that where we're going to, is important to us, and that to have positive futures as opposed to a very negative future, to lose purpose, to lose possibilities, to not have a sense of anything positive in the future can evoke a real clinical crisis in clients. Certainly, I know in my own life that my sense of well-being and happiness and fulfillment is very much linked to my sense of the future. I know, for instance, at the moment that just politically looking around the world and seeing the wars and the rise of very authoritarian politics affects me psychologically. It makes, it gives me a sense of, and of course, climate as well, gives me a sense of hopelessness at times that is a real challenge to me psychologically. So Frankl is very important, as well as other existential philosophers. Also for me, Carl Rogers, who is one of the most widely cited and used psychologists, who was the founder of humanistic psychology. And I think for me there's a gentleness in the work of Carl Rogers that tempers, for instance, the more maybe didactic elements of people like Frankl, in the importance of empathy, acceptance, relating. And I think for any therapeutic approach, whether we're working with goals or whether we're working with transference or any kind of psychological work, Rogers's understanding of the importance of the therapeutic relationship, and others who have then written about the therapeutic alliance, is really important. But something very important about Rogers was that he wrote, he talked about something, he said the facts are always friendly. And there's a lovely passage in Rogers where he talks about using research, and he talks about the way that sometimes they would do research and what the research would show was not what they believed in and not what they wanted to show, and was kind of disappointing. And his phrase, the facts are friendly, was about ultimately it's important to listen and be steered by the research, and particularly by the voices of clients, rather than maybe our own assumptions and beliefs and prejudices and egos about what we want the research to show and what we want the theory to be. So I know, for instance, in myself, in the work around goals, that I probably had more kind of adamant views about goals are really important. Everybody should have goals. Goal setting is critical for all therapy. I think if I went back maybe 10 years or so, when I worked with a colleague, John McLeod, developing a therapeutic model that we call pluralistic therapy, that was very much focused around goals. But I think through the qualitative research, through some of the quantitative research, through measure development, I'd like to think I've come to a more nuanced position that, while still feeling that goals work can be really important for some clients some of the time, also recognizing that it's not right for all clients. And that's something I've seen in the evidence. The evidence doesn't show, when we did qualitative interviews, we didn't find every single client saying, I love working with goals, I love setting goals, it was the most important part of my therapy. It was more nuanced, it was more differentiated across clients. And much though, it's hard, as Rogers says, to sometimes change your ideas, change your understandings. Ultimately, I think we have to be open to what the evidence is saying, and that helps us learn and develop and evolve as practitioners, as researchers, as theorists.
Good. So I have here your book, very,
Yeah.
I appreciate it so much, Working with Goals in Psychotherapy and Counseling. And I want to ask you, which is the most important lesson that you learned in this journey to write this book and also to edit it with a lot of good contributions? Which is the most important lesson you have learned?
That's a really good question. Well, I learned that Duncan Law is a great person to work with, and I really enjoyed working the book. There's many people doing some really interesting work around goals. I think what was most interesting for me was a few things. So one was writing about the really researching the psychology of goals. So one of the chapters I wrote in the book was about the psychology of goals. And one thing I like a lot about goals is that it really links into a very a large body of psychological research by people like Locke and Latham on goal setting and goal setting theory. And it made me recognize that although my research is mainly as a psychotherapy researcher, that there's so much in the psychology field that we can draw on about, for instance, what makes a good goal, where goals are effective, so many different motivational theories then related to goals around psychological motivation and how people establish motivation, the different phases of being motivated in goals. And I went on to develop some ideas around these different phases of goals and where goals come in and how they relate to things like hopes and aims and action. So I think making the link between the psychological and the psychotherapeutic was one really important part of that journey. I think the other one was seeing goals work in a broader context. So Duncan Law, who I work with on the book edited, mainly works around goal setting with young people and children. And he's been very successful in developing the goal-based outcome tool. And we're seeing now in the UK more of an emphasis on goals and using goal measures in work with children and young people, and actually his measures now being used with adults. And I think seeing that in the children and young people's field, in seeing in CBT, in psychodynamic, humanistic, that in all these different fields, there is a role for goals. I think the book gave me a sense that goals is something that can bring together therapists from a wide range of different perspectives. And actually, the book that I did after that, the one called Integrating Counselling and Psychotherapy, really uses the idea, not quite, I didn't call it goals, but I use this idea of directionality and the idea of the kind of forward movingness of human beings as an integrating theme for all therapies, and argued that whether you're doing CBT, whether you're working in a humanistic way, whether we're working in a psychodynamic way, what we're all trying to do effectively as therapists is helping clients get from where they are to where they want to be. And we have different methods for doing that and different understandings of how that might happen. But actually, it's the same thing. We want to help clients get to the places that they want to get to. Sometimes we have a sense of what's going to be most helpful for that. Sometimes we want to listen to clients. Nearly every therapist, I think, would agree that ultimately it's for clients to decide where it is that they want to be, provided that's not harming themselves or other people. So the idea of goals or directionality gives us a kind of a common language. That there's so many different therapies out there, 450 different therapies. It's a bit like the Tower of Babel. Often we're talking about different things, sorry, often we're talking about the same thing using different language. But I think if we talk about goals or, psychodynamic people, for instance, often don't like the term goals. Humanistic people aren't so keen because it feels very kind of hardened. But if we use that softer idea of directionality and movement forward, then that really gives us a kind of common language, common way of thinking about what it is that we're doing as therapists. We're helping people get to where they want to be. We're using different methods for that. We're helping people in the book that I wrote after that. We're helping people think about what I like this idea of synergies. So synergies is the idea that rather than people's goals pulling in different directions so that they get less of what they want in life. Part of our work as therapists at a very deep level is around helping clients find ways of getting what they want in life, where trying to get one thing like relatedness and trying to get something else like self-worth are actually pulling in the same direction rather than pulling the person in separate directions. So I think that idea that it creates a common language was also really helpful in that book.
Yeah. And it's a common experience, Mick, that sometimes in the scientific literature, it seems like dry and look sometimes to look for obvious theme, no? But I want to know if in your studying the scientific literature on goal setting, Did you come across some research that surprised you, that have a sort of wow experience just reading the results?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that surprised me most was, as I mentioned before, actually, this study that we did where we interviewed clients who'd been in our pluralistic therapy, and we asked them what they thought about goals. And they had a range of responses, and mostly they liked it, but there were some things that mostly they liked it. They felt that the goals gave them structure and gave them a kind of orientation in the work. They liked thinking about their goals. There were some things also that they weren't so positive about, particularly about when they felt it was too forced, which we've talked about earlier. But the thing that really surprised me and really stood out was that when it was going through the review process, they asked us to maybe link it to outcomes and the people's attitudes to outcomes. So we kind of codified how often they talked about positive things about goals versus how much they talked about negative things, and created a kind of index. The higher the score, the more they were talking about positive and less negative, and vice versa. And what we found was a really striking association. I mean, it was more than 10 times that the ones who talked about the positive aspects of goals had much, much, much better outcomes than the ones who were mainly negative about goals, um, and talked about them as being unhelpful. Now, it's a correlational finding, and it may partly be about the ones who had better outcomes then were more positive about the therapy generally, and the ones who are negative were more negative. But we did talk to them fairly early on in the therapy, so it wasn't that we just talked to them at the end, and maybe that the ones who were negative were more demoralized about the therapy. But it was the magnitude of difference actually, and it needs replicating. It may be that in other studies that we won't find the same thing, but I think that really surprised me just how much people who were kind of upbeat and talking about helpful things about goals seemed to get a lot more out of therapy than the ones who were more critical or more kind of questioning about it. So as I was saying before, I think that suggests that maybe clients' attitudes towards goals is something of an indicator of how well they might do in therapy, and maybe at what stage of change they're at. That was the one that really surprised me most. I think something else is that a lot of my work has been about developing goal measures and testing them, and testing their psychometrics. Um, so we developed what we just call the goals form, and I've also been looking at Duncan's goal-based outcome tool, which is more widely used. And what we've seen in the research is that generally psychometrically these measures are pretty good. That they are fairly reliable. They associate with other measures. They're often more sensitive to therapeutic interventions than more standardized measures. If you look at the internal reliability, which is how much these different items, say somebody's got 3 goals, is there correlation on these goals? Then we found that there was good internal reliability, which is what you'd like look for in a measure. Having said that, one of the things that I learned more recently when we were developing and doing a lot of testing on these measures is that when you're looking at these individualized measures, you should be using different criteria for more standardized measures. So whereas with standardized measures, for instance, you should be looking at, are they all measuring the same thing? There's a question with the goal measures about whether you would do that. And actually it's what's called formative rather than reflective measures. This is all stuff that I learned recently, formative rather than reflective. And actually it's okay to, if somebody changes a lot on one goal but not on another goal, then actually that's okay, and that doesn't mean the measure is wrong. If you use a standardized measure, say of depression, and somebody changes a lot on one item but not on other items, that suggests there's some problems with the measure. But with goals, not necessarily. And it's raised, in the community, and we've had meetings and lots of different people researching goals. We had a number of meetings. Um, it's provoked a lot of discussion about how you measure change on goals, and should you expect it all to be indicative of one general goal attainment dimension, or actually is it okay if people will change a lot on different goals? Just the other thing that is kind of quite surprising, but I feel quite hesitant about this. But what we've seen, we've done a few studies now where we've looked at change in young people and also in adults where goal measures have been used and where they haven't been used. And what we've seen is that there does seem to be, on the studies that I've seen, quantitatively, there does seem to be quite improved outcomes where goal measures are used as opposed to where they're not used. It's very early and we're still working on the papers, and there isn't a kind of definitive trial yet which has really compared, here's where we used goals, here's where we didn't. But the early indicative signs seem to suggest quite impressive effects for the goal measures, not on goals, but on things like kind of overcoming psychological distress and or more standardized measures using a goal measures. Early signs are that it's benefit, and obviously that's encouraging to see.
Perfect. And your way on working on goals has changed during your during the time. And when do you think over focusing on goals start to be a problem in working with patients?
I think it was really through doing a qualitative study. So I think we'll put the links to all these studies. I hope that in the article, and if people see this as a video, that we can give them the links to the studies. But a study led by Gina de Malta, which was a qualitative study, we really saw some of the patients that we spoke to, some of the clients, were saying that they yeah, that they didn't want kind of consistent goal monitoring, that it could be too much. Some of them clearly said that they needed more time. Not all of them, but some of them said, as well as the positive things, talked about needing more time. We've now also seen that we've done a qualitative study led by Charlie Duncan with young people that we're hoping to publish soon. And again, we found that for some of the young people, they felt that they didn't want to, for instance, monitor goals every week. They wanted a bit more time to think about their goals, and they liked it. I mean, there was lots of positive things, but there was also more challenging things. And I think in terms of monitoring goals, in terms of thinking about how we work with goals, there's more. There's challenges as well as positives. I, I think it's really important to recognize that in terms of using goals in therapy, we are still at a very early stage. I mean, it's great the work that you're doing and that you've been writing about this and, disseminating information about it. But research-wise, there's so much more that we still need to learn about when it's helpful, how it's helpful, I think is really important. Um, is it helpful because it gives the client something to think about? Maybe it's also very helpful because it's about helping to develop the alliance. And I think that we know that the alliance is a really important predictor of good outcomes. It might be that when you talk to clients about questions like, what are your goals, that it's helpful because it makes them feel that they're collaborative in the therapy and that they're part of the therapy. And, so the mechanism is still something that we still need to know more about. Whether it has actually has an effect on outcomes, as I say, early signs suggest that maybe it does have an effect, but that's something that we need to do more research on. So, I think my views have changed, and I hope they will continue to change. I hope they'll continue to change as we learn more things, and certainly, while for many clients goals are helpful, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to learn, and I think I'll carry on changing.
Good. And now the last question is, what do you see as the most significant challenge for psychology and for psychological well-being in this contemporary world? And what is the role of psychotherapy?
Do you mean in terms of goals or just more generally?
In general.
Okay. That's a big question. That's a big question. And I would have a lot of answers to that. Well, I think that, so one answer, first answer would be that there's some really exciting work that's going on around personalizing therapy. And that whereas maybe 10, 20 years ago, a lot of the research was about um, particular interventions and looking at, say, dialectical behavior therapy or cognitive analytic therapy or psychosynthesis and looking at the effectiveness of these therapies and saying, is it effective or not, which is still very important research and I think very valuable. What I've seen in the psychotherapy research field is more of an emphasis on personalization and beginning to think about for what clients at what particular points in their development might a particular therapy be helpful. And people like James Delgadillo at the University of Sheffield in the UK, Zachary Cohen in the States, have been real key figures in helping to develop more nuanced understandings of what is going to work for whom. Gordon Poole, back in the 60s, talked about, you know, what treatment for whom, when, and that we need to personalize therapy. But with the emergence of large data sets and artificial intelligence, it allows us now to uh, calculate, analyze these large bodies of data that can really help us understand how we might improve the personalization of therapy. And James Delgadillo has been doing research which shows that if you offer people a personalized treatment, then they can do better. But that's just between a kind of more intensive and less intensive. But there's so many options when we think about should somebody have CBT or should somebody have psychodynamic or humanistic, but we can really start to refine down our understanding of what will work. And I think a large part of that will also be about thinking about how goals will integrate into that. So if somebody's goal, for instance, is to change the way they think or to work on anxiety, it might be that CBT is much more indicated. If somebody's goal is to understand about their past, it may be that a psychodynamic approach is more effective. And I think integrating goals in and developing the evidence about goals and where goals work so that it can be integrated into these personalized systems will be very important for us in the goals field. I think also, so that would be a first answer. I think a second answer, just thinking about goals, is that I think we need to understand more about how you work most effectively with goals. So work that you're doing, and I know in Canada there's colleagues with young people who are looking at best practice with goals. And questions like when should you introduce talking about goals? How do you know whether goals is going to be helpful for a client? What kind of questions is it best to ask? How do you monitor it? How often do you come back to it? All those questions. It would be great to have more research in those areas so that we can understand more and more about how goals integrate in as a part of an effective therapeutic intervention. So that'd be my second answer. And then my third answer, and a lot of my work recently has been more at the interface between psychotherapy and social change. So I don't think we can isolate psychotherapy from the reality of the world that we inhabit at the moment. We're facing some major challenges like climate change, growing inequalities, economic hardships, war, and whether our clients are directly influenced by those or not, certainly indirectly, many of the people that we work with are worried about climate change, or they're anxious about the wars that are going on in Israel and Gaza or in the Ukraine. So even if we think of psychotherapy as something separate from politics, I think these issues are there, and thinking about how we as therapists work with and address, say, climate anxiety is an important question. But I also think, and for me, this is where my work has tended to go, is also thinking, do we as therapists have something useful to contribute to wider change in the political field? And I think we do. I think that we as therapists understand very deeply, or learn to understand very deeply, about how people experience distress. We learn through, for instance, relational therapies, effective techniques for managing conflict between people, whether that's in a couple, whether that's in a group, or whether that's in a family. We learn, for instance, that blaming people doesn't tend to be particularly effective, that being able to talk about our feelings and recognize and mentalize and think about the other's mind and empathize are all helpful strategies. Being compassionate tends to be an effective interpersonal strategy. And I think there's a lot that the wider political sphere could learn from our understandings about how to address and resolve problems. That, for instance, political systems that are based on blame, criticism, we're right, you're wrong, demonizing particular groups of people like asylum seekers or refugees, um, that we know from therapy that when you demonize and when you separate and when you push away something, as Freud taught us so many years ago, the repressed return, that suppression, marginalization doesn't seem to be particularly effective. What helps, as we know as therapists, is dialogue, compassion, empathy. Um, and I think as therapists, thinking about how we can disseminate that out, not as the answer to everything, but as part of maybe some of these global solutions, being able to think, being able to see the bigger picture, for instance, with climate change, recognizing that, if you're working with a family, you know that the different people have to compromise and talk about their needs and think about solutions and work together for solutions, because it's an interdependent system. Our planet is an interdependent system where nations can't just go, I'm going to do this and you do that, and we're all linked together. So thinking about how we can talk to each other is really important. And I think as therapists, we have a lot that we can contribute to helping to ameliorate some of those problems.
Perfect. And the last curiosity, Mick, is there a book that changed your life? And what book do you recommend us?
Is there a book? So probably the psychology book that impacted me more than anything else was Carl Rogers's On Becoming a Person, 1961. I think I read that as an undergraduate, and I think the compassion and the care and the gentle politics. People talk about Rogers as a gentle revolutionary, and I think that that's always massively impacted me in my career. That idea of a kind of radicalism, but radicalism in its gentleness and in its compassion for others and in its understanding for others. And I think that's always framed how I'd seen things. So that's probably, of all the books that I've read, the one that has most affected me. Also, I guess Rogers talks a lot about the value of being authentic and being genuine to ourselves, and that that compassion to others and compassion to ourselves is about accepting who we really are, and ideas that are very simple and kind of widely accepted now, but I guess were radical at the time when there was so much pressure on people to comply and conform. And Rogers really emphasizes the possibilities of being authentic, and that it has the value that it has. So that would be definitely one. And I think another one would, to recommend for people interested in goals. If you haven't read it already, I would encourage people to read Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's a very widely read book. It's been massively influential. It's very accessible. Mostly it's about his experiences in Auschwitz, I think, in the death camps. But he also talks about his own search for meaning and the value of meaning in therapy. And it's a difficult book to read, and obviously there's a trigger warning. It can be traumatic for some people to read, but if you haven't read it and if you would feel okay about reading it, I think that's such an important, powerful book. He doesn't talk specifically about goals, but he does talk about the need and the search for meaning. And as I was said at the beginning of the interview, for me, that's what goals is ultimately about.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Mick.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Bernardo.
much to Mick Cooper and for his words. Again, I recommend another of his book, that is this one,
Yeah.
Pluralistic, Counseling and Psychotherapy. And so look at his website, and thank you again.
Thank you, Bernardo. It's a real pleasure talking to you.